Before time and vandalism marred its finely crafted facade, Elm Bluff could have held its own along a fashionable residential street of Lower Manhattan. For Elm Bluff is a New York house in the Deep South. John J. Crochran came to Alabama from Staten Island to seek his fortune. His great-niece, Virginia Crochran Gildersleeve, wrote about Elm Bluff in her published memoirs.
In those days, travel was almost entirely by the river steamers, which had a habit of running on mud banks and being delayed for a day or two at a time. Gentlemen from the plantations for many miles around used to ride to Elm Bluff and settle down with my great-uncle for as long as might be necessary, until their steamer came along the river and carried them on down to Mobile. In the big house at Elm Bluff, there was a large library, and there, laid out on a long table, were American periodicals and many European ones. I like to know this and realize that the people who lived in Alabama in those long ago days were not cut off from the world.
Fairhope was the home of an Air Force pilot, a banker, and an Episcopal priest. Robert Westbrook was all three. When Westbrook retired from the Air Force in 1970, he moved into the Gothic Revival home built by his great-grandfather, Joseph Selden, as the center of a 1,000-acre plantation. Rather than farming the land himself, Westbrook rented the land to others while he pursued a career in banking. He became quite interested in the Episcopal Church and ultimately retired from his position as a bank vice president to be ordained an Episcopal priest. He served as a pastor for several churches until his death in 1987. When restoration of the Coger House began in 1991, one wall had collapsed and there was vegetation growing inside the roof. Its owner had donated the structure to a Florence Historic Preservation Group with the stipulation that it be restored according to strict federal guidelines and occupied as a private home. A buyer was found, and this Georgian cottage was saved. Fire destroyed the Richard Crochran house sometime after 1920. It was here that Union and Confederate troops met in April 1865 to discuss prisoner exchanges at the end of the Civil War. 4 columns keep lonely vigil, a fragile skeleton, traces of the past. A half-mile tree-lined lane leads to the cluster of buildings at Pruitt Oaks. Surrounded by tall oak trees are the plantation big house, the detached kitchen, and a smokehouse. A fire set here by Union soldiers during the war between the states was quelled, saving the home, which has been in the Pruitt family for 6 generations.
Well, it was a complete plantation. My grandfather had roughly around 500 slaves. And the field to the east, as you drive up the driveway, was a racetrack. All the neighbors used to come on Sunday afternoon and they'd race horses. I have lived here all my life. I was born here, my father was born here. And my grandfather bought this place in the 1850s. It was a happy home and we always entertained, and my mother loved to entertain, and the house was usually full of guests. And we enjoyed having them, and we enjoyed living here. I have friends to tell me that you need to sell out and go somewhere else, but it wouldn't be home. That's the worst thing you can do for an older person, is move them from where they have been accustomed to living. It's terrible. They're used to that, and you put them in a different environment, and they're not happy at all. The little inconvenience doesn't bother you. And they being cold, and you stay upstairs, and you put on an overcoat to come back down, go to the kitchen, it's warm, and you can't heat the whole house. It's just not practical. We heat rooms. And so often in the old places, all of the original layers have died. And the grandchildren, not unless they've been brought up to appreciate old things, don't care anything about old things. They'd rather sell it and buy something new.
Most plantation slave quarters were hardly an attractive sight. This pair of cabins, with their steeply pitched gable roofs, reflect the relatively privileged status of slaves chosen to serve in the master's household. Following the Civil War, a federal agency known as the Freedmen's Bureau was established to administer the transition of former slaves to freedom. In June 1865, the Freedmen's Bureau of Uniontown recorded an agreement between the former slaves of this plantation and R.H. Adams.
The said Adams agrees and binds himself to allow said Negroes for the faithful performance of their labor for the remainder of the year 1865, 1/4 part of the net proceeds of the crop of corn, peas, and potatoes now growing on the plantation. The said Negroes are to be furnished their usual clothing, shoes, hats, together with fuel and medical attention. It is further agreed upon that unless said Negroes work faithfully, they forfeit all claims and interest in the aforementioned crops. Only those who work in the field or aid in carrying on the operations of the plantation shall be entitled to their share of the crop aforesaid.
Remnants of life on the move remain as they were haphazardly dropped at the McClendon house. Years of itinerant living have left their mark, evidence of a series of temporary tenants. This post-war plantation house speaks of economic changes in the South after the Civil War. They're called shotgun houses because their narrow design prompted someone to say you could shoot straight through them, front to back. Though small in size, this pair in Selma was decorated in the manner of high-style Queen Anne contemporaries. In their prime, they were located at the heart of a bustling black community known as the End.
The Inn was on Broad Street. I guess the focal point of the Inn was the Roxy Theater, which was a black movie house that we paid 10 cents to go to when I was a child. Right in that area, you had a restaurant by the name of Bruff Fields. You had Clay's Casino. You had Louise. You had Stella Brown's. This was a area where there were black businesses. And I don't know where the name of the inn came from, but everybody in Selma said, we're going on the inn. I just came from the inn. I'm going down to the inn. It was the only place that we had to go and just, like kids hang out now. This was the place where we went in the afternoons and we stood in front of Louise and we had ice cream or a Coke or something, a piece of pie, a glass of milk. That was the extent of our activity here in Selma. I think after integration, when the theaters were integrated, the Roxy was closed. The VFW, the building where the VFW club was torn down, Bruff Fields was torn down. It just deteriorated. I think integration took away a lot of the black-owned businesses. When it happened, we were glad it happened, but it did take away something from the black community.
Like many Southern homes, the Hawley house started small and grew along with the family and family fortunes. First one wing and then another was added, yielding 2 dog trot halls and inviting porches decorated with gingerbread trim. This home recalls a time when friends dropped by on Sunday afternoons and family relaxed on the porch swing, watching a slow-paced world go by. The rural and small-town homes of 19th century Alabama reflect the hopes and dreams of the people who built them and cared for them through the years. Each home has a story, and the stories they tell define our past and the rich heritage of the Deep South.